Now we welcome our speaker for today, who is Phil Revell. And Phil will be taking us back in time some 500 years. It seems to be the
Officer Barry, very please.
400 years, from 1620. On the 20th. Take us back 500 years to talk about a Shropshire family whose children sailed away on a very famous ship indeed. Please welcome Phil Revell.
Who does have O-level maths, believe it or not? Right, now then, I did cheat. In those days, you could write the cosine sine formula on the inside of your pencil case. I'm not sure if I'd get away with that. So, can you hear me at the back?
No.
Yes. Can or cannot?
No. Yes.
No. Right, okay, that's fine. So, I don't like being tied to a microphone. So, this story begins in a number of places. I'm going to start it here. This is Shipton Church. It's south of Muchwenlock in Corvedale, and it's a very pretty church and is well worth a visit. It's open most of the time, and we visited, my wife and I visited Shipton Church in 2009, 2010, in that winter. And we wandered round, we looked at the graveyard. It's a very simple church, it's not ornate. But on the inside wall of the church is this memorial plaque. And as you can see, the memorial plaque commemorates 4 children who were baptised in the church. And those 4 children, Eleanor, Jasper, Richard and Mary, sailed on the Mayflower to America in 1620. Now when I looked at this part, right, as an ex-history teacher in the dim and distant past, I knew it couldn't be true, but it obviously was true, because the plaque has been placed by the Massachusetts Society, who are the preeminent organisation in America to commemorate the voyage of the Mayflower. So it set my curiosity aflame, and I started to do some research. In the back of the little church is a booklet written by a historian called Donald Harris, and I went and had a long and very pleasant evening talking to Donald about his work, and he handed me his research folders, and that was a very good starting point. Donald is unfortunately no longer with us. And why was I so sceptical about the plaque? Well, I was so sceptical about the plaque because the voyage of the Mayflower is possibly one of the most famous voyages made by a ship in history. We know everything about it. We know where it started from, where it finished. We know the names of the people on board the ship. The captain, the crew, and the passengers. They're listed. And as a history teacher, I was reasonably familiar with that voyage. And I knew that nobody from Shropshire was on that ship. And I did a quick check. You can look it up on the internet. I found the passenger list. And the passenger list does not list anyone from Shropshire on that ship. But interestingly, it did list the 4 children. But it said that they were orphans from London. So, right at the very beginning of the story, we have a mystery. So, let's take it from there. Let's remind ourselves about the who and the where and the what. This is the where. This is Shipton, here, bottom left, where the church is. You can miss it actually. If you drive that road, you can go round the bend and completely miss the church. A little bit further to the north we've got Lardon Hall and Lardon Grange, and that today is the site of quite a large farm, Lardon Farm. And then a little bit further on you've got Brockton, which is in a dip. And if you drive that road, or if you've ever driven that road, you'll know that between there and Craven Arms, the road goes through a series of dips. It's very South Shropshire. So that's the where. And the children were baptised in Shipton Church. Let's go back a few hundred years to Corvedale as it might have been in 1610. This is a map, a bit later than 1610 actually, but this is a map of the area. And again we've got the church at Shipton marked. We've got Lardon Hall marked with the stream running down through the land and a footpath leading straight to the hall from a bridle way that leads up from Brockton. The bridle way is still there, you can walk it. The footpath is still there, you can walk it. It leads straight to the farm. If you walk it straight to the farm, you will see the ruins of a building. And that building is the old Lardon Hall. This is Lardon Hall. And over here, we've got the Tudor building, mid-16th century. To the left is what looks like a Victorian addition, but it isn't. The stone-built building was built in 1608 as a substantial addition to the original Tudor house at a time when quite a lot of people were moving away from wood and towards stone as a building material, partly because wood was actually in quite short supply. And so, despite its sort of Victorian appearance, that stone-built building was originally built in 1608. And a bit of research into what the building may have cost came up with a figure of £600. Now that obviously is not modern money, but I'm told by a builder it was a very complicated. You know what builders are like. If you try and get any kind of figure out of them, they will hedge until doomsday. But eventually, he told me that to build an extension like that, if the stone could be obtained locally, and if you already owned the land, he said such an extension would probably cost something in the region of £60,000 to £70,000 to build. Which gives you an idea as to the relative values of money between the two periods of time. Perhaps I should have gone to a cheaper builder, I'm not sure. But certainly that gives you an idea. It's almost impossible to make direct comparisons to what £1 then would equal in terms of £1 now, because we spend our money on different things. Land, for example, at that time was cheap, whereas land today is quite expensive. iPhones didn't exist, so it's difficult. But for most purposes, if you multiply the £1610 by around about 75 to 100, you will get more or less a modern equivalent. So, Lardon Hall. Who lived at Lardon Hall? Who were the people that we are talking about? The Moors lived at Lardon Hall. And there were two branches of the Moore family. One branch lived at Lardon, and that was the left-hand branch. And the gentleman living at Lardon Hall in 1610 was Jasper More, who had 8 children, not all of whom survived. by his wife Elizabeth, and one of those children, the youngest, was Katherine More. On the other side of the family, and in fact the other side of Shropshire, near Bishop's Castle, and the estate of Linley, which is near a tiny hamlet called More, that is not a coincidence, was the different branch of the family. And there lived Richard More of Linley with his wife Sarah, who was the daughter of a merchant from Shrewsbury. He, at the time, had 2 children, Samuel and Anne. We're not sure of Samuel's birth date, but it seems to be, according to other evidence, round about 1594. And Samuel is, as it says on the family tree, is the eldest boy. Was the eldest boy of the family. And in 1610, Samuel married his cousin Katherine. By no means unusual. Families quite often married within families. They were not first cousins. Interestingly, one branch of the family, Jasper, was a man of the gentry. He was a justice of the peace. He owned land, but he was not rich. He was not a man of means. On the other side of Shropshire, north of Bishop's Castle at Linley, Richard was a man of means. His family had made a great deal of money. And in Shropshire terms, he would have been seen as a very rich man. And so, interestingly, the rich side of the family is marrying the poor side of the family. Or poorer, anyway. And that marriage occurred in 1610. And if we scoop around a bit, we go to here. And we've got the 4th of February, 1610, when Samuel More, Generosus, married his cousin Katherine More of Lardon on that day. Now, in case you're wondering why it is that the 31st of December 1610 is followed by the 4th of February 1610, this is because at the time, the year moved from March to the following March. And the change of year on most documents was recorded at the beginning of April. Confusingly for the historian, this is not true of all documents, and some personal diaries and family records were kept January to January. This is an absolute pain in the neck if you're trying to do family research in this period, because you've got confusing information about which year is which. So much so normal. A family wedding between 2 cousins. What is unusual about this? Well, a few details before about. Oh yes, let's put some pictures on this. This is Samuel, not on his wedding day. This is Samuel much later in life. This was when he was 63. This is after, in fact, the English Civil War, when this painting was done. But it's the only portrait that we have of him. So this is Samuel More. Nice set of curls. This is his father, Richard More, and this painting was probably done at some point in the 1620s. So after the main events in the story that we're talking about. And we don't have a picture of Katherine. So we have to imagine what a woman of the period would have looked like. And because it's close to the Tudor era, people tend to imagine very, very stiff dresses with a huge ruff and so on. But those fashions ceased to be fashionable virtually the year that Elizabeth died. She liked wearing them, and therefore the ladies of the court had to wear them, and therefore they were fashionable. But when she died, people moved to wearing a much softer style of clothing. And so this is probably what Katherine may have looked like, if we use our imagination a lot. The waistcoat jacket that this woman is wearing is called the Maidstone jacket. It's a copy actually, it's not the genuine. It's in the Victorian Albert Museum, and it is dated by the Victorian Albert Museum 1610. You'll notice that it has sleeves, and what's more, they are sewn in sleeves, which was a radical development of the time. Previously to that, if you wore sleeves, they were detachable, and you attached them with hooks and eyes to your jacket. But from about this time on, English women started wearing jackets with sleeves. So a major change at this time. You can see it's a much softer look than what the Tudor women would have worn. So, what's unusual about the wedding? Well, let's step out of the story just for a while and do some historical context. What was the place, what was the status of a daughter at this time, especially if she was the youngest daughter? And of course, Catherine had 3 older sisters. Well, the youngest daughter, in fact all the daughters, were the property of their father. Property is not too strong a word. And when a daughter married, it was almost certainly arranged by her father. Not an arranged marriage in the modern sense that someone from a community, for say in the Middle or Far East might have, but a more contractual arrangement. And Catherine's wedding contract was signed between her father Jasper and Samuel's father Richard in October before the wedding. It's a legal contract setting out the property. And one of the key points of such a contract was the dowry. Because if you were a young woman at this time, and if you were of means, certainly if you were of the gentry, you could not marry respectably without a dowry. And a dowry was a sum of money that was passed from the woman's family to the man's family on the day of the wedding. Now, if you think this is medieval, and if you think this is a practice which belongs firmly in the Tudor era, can I remind you, I'll tell you a story about my wedding. All right? My wedding took place in 1976 in Cambridge. I was a rough northerner. My lady was considerably more refined and still is. Now, in the run-up to the wedding, there was much discussion between the two families as to who should pay for the wedding, because the tradition was quite firmly that the daughter's family paid for the wedding. My family, being from Boughton, were not keen on this arrangement, but we did come to a compromise. Now what? Now that tradition was still alive in the 70s. And maybe today. I've not been involved in weddings recently. My son's shown no inclination to get married whatsoever. But what is that arrangement other than a dowry? What is the arrangement that the bride's family pay for the proceedings, which in a modern context can be anything up to 30 grand? What is that other than a dowry? An expectation that the woman brings something into the marriage. That's a dowry by any other name. So, there was a dowry to be paid. But Catherine's father and Catherine herself faced the dilemma of any father who's got lots of daughters. Because lots of money had already been paid out. Her eldest had got married to the rector at Upton Magna. Very respectable marriage. The next girl down got married to a merchant from Worcester and went to live in Worcester. Again, a respectable marriage. The next girl down married Francis Grigg, who was an apprentice from London. We are running out of money here, I sense. And when it came for Catherine to get married, there was no money left. And so the choice is that she doesn't get married. And what were the realities for such a woman in 1610? Well, she could stay at home and be an unpaid servant to her mother for the rest of their lives, which many women did. Or she could go into the church and become a nun, which many women did. The romantic alternative did not exist. You could not run away with the boy next door. You would have been seized and returned to your family. And just down the road from Catherine's house is Shipton Hall. Shipton Hall is a very nice Tudor building. It's not open very often. Do check it for when it is open, because it is worth going to see. But only one of the upstairs rooms at Shipton Hall, in the bedroom that used to belong to the daughter of the house, is inscribed on the window a poem which records how she had been locked in her bedroom for years because she refused to marry the man that her father had chosen for her. And that's what happened. But Catherine did get married. And what's more, she married at the age of 25. Now, in the times of the 1600s, this would have made her an old lady. Now, I can see lots of the women present who might be a few days older than 25 thinking I'm misusing the term. No, because the average woman in the 1600s was dead by the time she was 40. If you went into Shrewsbury in 1616 or 1610 and strolled the streets, you would see the majority of the people would be below 40. You would see some older men, and some men would gain their 70 years and 10. But for a woman, it's a different story. Because a woman would go through childbirth, not once, not twice, not 3 or 4 times, but 12 or more times. Anything up to 20 children at a time when obstetrics, I'll never pronounce that correctly, was not even in its infancy. That's a mixing of metaphors, isn't it, really? And so your chances of surviving all these childbirths decreased every time. So the majority of women died in childbirth, or as a result of complications arising from childbirth. So to be alive in your 40s as a woman and beyond almost certainly meant that you were unmarried, as Elizabeth I was, of course, or you were a widow, always good to be a widow, or that you were very, very fortunate. So, Catherine, the term old lady applied to Catherine is not completely inappropriate. We all look on the other side of the family, though. We discover that Samuel, on the day of his wedding was 17. Now, this really is unusual. Young men of whatever class very rarely married before they were 21. A marriage might be arranged, and in some cases there was actually a ceremony to record the event, and that might happen, you know, very, very young, 4 or 5 years old, where the families had agreed that these two young people would be together in the future. But they didn't live with each other. It wasn't a marriage in truth. Whereas this was. Samuel married Catherine when he was 17. What's more, as far as we can work out, we think his birthday was January. So this boy was 1 month 17 when he got married. And then we discover from the contract, which is in the archive here in Shrewsbury, we discover from the contract something else that is unusual. We discover that there was a dowry, but it was paid the other way. The boy's family paid the girl's family. Now, this was very unusual. So why and how and what? Well, the what gives you a clue as to the why. Because the sum of the dowry paid on the wedding day from Richard to Jasper, not to the young couple, they didn't get the money, the fathers exchanged the money. The sum of the money paid on the wedding day from Richard to Jasper was £600. Does that strike a chord with anybody? I flick backwards and forwards, so I may not get... Yes, there we are. This extension cost £600. Now, that's all we know. That's all we know. So, to extrapolate from that, we have to do a bit of historical guesswork. We do know that Jasper was not a rich man, and yet he committed to nearly doubling the size of his house with a stone-built extension costing £600. The totality of his effects when he died, not including his land, was £340. Jasper could not afford to build this building. But he had sons. And he had an eldest boy who was of the gentry. And think about what we've just learned. That sons were valuable because if they made a good marriage, that brought money into the family. And we discover that in 1608, the eldest boy was killed in a duel, and the duel was fought over a woman. No, I'm afraid I don't know any more than that. But I felt it was justified to join the jigsaw pieces together, so this is my theory about what may have happened. I think the boy was contracted to be married. I think there was a substantial dowry due to be paid. I think the stupid duel the boy got himself killed. No marriage, no dowry, no money to pay for the extension. And I believe the extension was probably built for the boy and his new bride to move into. But it never happened. And suddenly, Jasper is left having to pay £600, money that he does not have. 3 of his daughters are already wed. The only asset he has is his land in Corvedale. Land that has been in the More family since just after the Norman conquest. He would have to break up the family estate. And at this moment, the other branch of the family decides that that is not acceptable. And no matter what the social expectations of the time in terms of a dowry, Richard will use his money to keep the family land together. So he and the Jasper get together and they arrange a marriage. My boy will marry your girl. And what seals this arrangement, what provides the kind of the QED at the end of the equation, is the fact that in the contract where the land was, where the £600 was exchanged, all the land, including the house, associated with Jasper and Lardon, transferred on the day of the wedding to, not to Samuel, to Richard, to the father-in-law. He got the money, he got the land, he got the house. Jasper and his wife Elizabeth were permitted to stay in the house, to carry on living there. Samuel and his new bride were given tabling. And tabling in a contract at the time means bed and board. But it wasn't their house, it was Richard's house. But they did, they lived there. And as we know from the plaque and from the baptismal records at Shipton Parish Church, there were 4 children. And life for a number of years continued normally until May 1616, when an extraordinary event happened. And the details of that extraordinary event are set out in a document that came to light in the last 50 years. And this is that document. It was written to the Right Honourable Sir James Lee, Knight, and the Lord Chief Justice of England at the time. I'm going to shift it off, otherwise it will give my punchline away. So, what happened? How did we see that document? Where did that document surface? How do we know that this is true? The document surfaced in 1959 with the modern day Jasper More, who my guess is quite a lot of you have probably realised is the man who was the MP for Ludlow in the 70s and the 80s, who still lived at Lindley Hall until a few years ago, until he died. Jasper More, in 1959, was going through the family documents and came across a parchment document that was clearly very old. Knowing such documents quite often were of value, he had it professionally assessed. And he sent it to the College of Heralds in London, which is the kind of thing that you can do if you're an MP. The College of Heralds, all of whom have amazing names like Griffin Pursuivant and so on, the College of Heralds gave the document to one of their senior researchers, and he authenticated the document. And by authenticating the document, he discovered that 4 children named in the document were the same 4 children that were on the passenger list of the Mayflower. So we established the connection. We move back. We go back, Courtdale as it was in 1610. We go back to this road, this one, which is the main road from Much Wenlock to Craven Arms. And it's dawn, about 5 o'clock in the morning. The sun is just coming over Clee Hill. And in the hedges on the road, at the foot of the track that leads up to Lardon Hall, were a band of armed men. At least a dozen, possibly 20. With them are 2 wagons, not carriages, wagons, farm wagons. And on the wagons are at least 2 women. As soon as they have enough light to see by, the group make their way up to the house. It's not a castle. It was not built for defence. England has not had a war since the War of the Roses. Tudor buildings were not built for defence. And so getting into the house would have been easy. The men get into the house, they search the property. There does not seem to be any resistance. In fact, there don't appear to have been any men in the house at the time. They find the things that they have come looking for, and they carry them out to the wagons, and they make their departure. And the things that they were looking for were the 4 children, the youngest of which was less than a month old, which is why there were women on the wagons, because that child would have needed to be breastfed on the way to where they were going. And where were they going? They were going to make the journey from Lardon Hall in Corvedale to Linley Hall near Bishop's Castle, because the men were the servants of Richard More, the father-in-law. Now, how do I know this? Was I there? I know it partly because in the document, the legal document that was discovered in the 50s, we are told that the children were removed. How do I know the detail? Partly the dates, you can work out the dates. It can't have been, it must have been after the youngest child was born, which places it after April. And for reasons that I'll get to shortly, I know it was before June. So May, it happened in May. Why the dawn bit? Why the dramatic dawn bit? Well, if you drive today from that house to Linley, it takes you 45 minutes in a car. I'm reliably informed by people who know about horses that if you were to take horses on decent roads on that same journey, you would have to allow between 10 and 12 hours. Because you wouldn't want to go over the Mind. You've got to go round the Mind. Because you've got wagons. So, it must have been daylight, because they did not travel in darkness. And so they would have wanted every minute of daylight available to them. So yes, they would have been waiting there at dawn. I am absolutely certain that that is the case, even though there is nothing actually in writing which says it. But that brings us to the why. Why? Why did Samuel and his father remove the children from their mother? Why? And for that, we go back to the document. The reasons moving to this manner of disposing of the said children are as follows. It obviously wasn't typed in 1620. I've typed it. But it is the original spellings and the original format for the document. And the document did have quite a few mistakes in it, including simple mistakes in Latin, which leads me to think that the document was a draft and that it was never actually presented to the court. Impriments, the common fame and adulterous leaf of the said Katherine More with one Jacob Blakeway, a fellow of mean parentage and condition, which continued long before the said Samuel suspected it, and after it was known to the said Samuel that the apparent likeness and resemblance of most of the said children in their visage and lineaments of their bodies to the said Blakeway. And you read this and you think, golly. But then you think, as a historian, you think, well, hold on a minute. I know men are not very observant. But are we seriously suggesting that this lady has conducted an adulterous affair with the same bloke for 4 years and nobody has noticed. She's living in the same house as her mother. Her sisters visit regularly. What's more, although this family are not rich, for most families of the gentry who, at this time, they would have servants. Servants sleep in the same room as you. Or they sleep outside your door. They don't have separate servants' quarters, they sleep there. So that if you wake up and are in need of something in the night, they can attend to you. It's one of the reasons why 4-poster beds have curtains. Now, National Trust people will say, oh, it's because to keep the drafts out. No, 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 no. So, straight away, I'm suspicious about this document. And then the children. Again, men are not very observant. But we all know the moment. Auntie Ady comes round. Oh, isn't he lovely? Oh, he's got his father's. Oh, did nobody else notice? So it makes one suspicious. And how did Katherine react? And how did her family react? Well, her father, by this time, is dead. But her mother is living there. Was she thrown out? No. Did she throw herself in the Corve and drift downstream towards Ludlow? No. Actually, the Corve's not deep enough, but you know, it's a nice image. Was she shunned by the valley? No. What she did was make arrangements to travel to Hereford Cathedral. She wrote and asked for an appointment with the Chancellor of the Diocese, the Cathedral Chancellor, who was responsible for legal matters at the time. She would have to have made arrangements because the journey to Hereford would have taken several days. She made that journey in June. And the person who accompanied her on that journey was a local man called Jacob Blakeway. And in Hereford, she presented herself to the Chancellor, who was called Oliver Lloyd, who went on to be Bishop of Wales, which is a completely different story, but that's who she met. The meeting is recorded. And she presented a case that Jacob was her true husband, and that her marriage to Samuel was false, and that therefore the children were truly her and Jacob's children. Again, to the 21st century mind, this is ridiculous. We immediately say to ourselves, come on girl, you got married, you went to church, there's an entry in the register. But to the 17th century mind, the 16th, because we're at the turn of the century, the 16th, 17th century mind, this would have made absolute sense. Remember, a girl is her father's property, and on the marriage, she becomes her husband's property. Think about it in terms of property. You cannot sell a used car on the Saturday and sell it again to a different person on the Sunday. That is not legal. It is the first contract that is the binding contract. And therefore, what she was saying was that she had a pre-contract to marry Jacob. And it's also important to realise that this was actually before the modern marriage ceremony, which actually was in the King James Bible, which came out a couple of years later. What many people did at this time was have a family contract arrangement several years or months before the wedding. And on the day of the wedding itself, yes, they would go to church, and yes, there would be an entry in the register, but this was a blessing upon an existing contract. And how seriously people took that blessing would depend upon how seriously their own religious views were. The key thing was the contract. And if she was betrothed to Jacob, that was a contract. And so Oliver Lloyd in Hereford didn't sit back. Actually, he wouldn't have had a desk, would he? But he wouldn't sit back in scandal. No, he simply asked them both a question. Where are your witnesses? Show me witnesses. But they had none. Her brothers were dead. One of them had killed himself in a duel. 2 others had died in circumstances that we're not sure of. Jacob's father was dead. He did have a brother, but much, much younger, not old enough to witness a contract. So there were no witnesses. And in case the women present haven't fully grasped what life was like in 1600s, yeah, here's a further reminder. Yes, the women were still alive. Catherine's mother was still alive. Jacob's mother, Angerd, was still alive. But they were women. And women could not witness a contract. Interestingly, they could be tortured. You were allowed to torture women for evidence, but they could not be witnesses in court. I'm at a safe distance, you see. I feel a lot safer saying these things. When I do it to smaller audiences, I wear armour. So, Catherine and Jacob were sent away. But Oliver Lloyd must have said something to Catherine that gave her hope. Because almost immediately, that same month, she made arrangements to go to London and launch an appeal. And what she was trying to do was to get her marriage to Jacob declared legal and gain possession of her children. And these legal actions continued for the next 4 years, with anything up to 16 or 17 appearances in court. There are 17 actions recorded, but some of those may have been the same action on the same day. And again, as a historian, actually this time as an ex-journalist, I read this and I thought, this doesn't add up. Literally, it doesn't add up. Because one of the things that one is told as a journalist is to follow the money. Who paid for this? Because, you know, when you receive a press release telling you that X product is absolutely wonderful, and that scientific research has proved that X product is absolutely wonderful, what I do is go to the bottom of the press release and say, right, who paid for the research? Who paid for this? And if I discover that the Chocolate Manufacturers Association has paid for research that tells us that chocolate is wonderful, then I'm inclined to be sceptical about the research. So, who paid? Catherine did not have any money. Her father was not well off. He wouldn't have paid for this anyway, besides which he was dead. Her husband was certainly not going to pay for this. I did have someone who was well versed in the history of the period in an audience once, and he pointed out, quite rightly, that at the time a husband was responsible for his wife's spending. Yes, so in theory, Samuel was responsible for every penny that Catherine spent. But she was going to lawyers. She was going to lawyers and spending money. And I think the lawyers would have been sceptical as to whether they would actually ever receive the money from Samuel in a dispute which pitted her against him. And a lot of her expenses were day-by-day expenses. At the time, to journey from Shrewsbury to London in good weather on dry roads would take 2 weeks. We're talking about a month there and back. And so that's staying in inns, Chelmsford, Oxford, Reading. possibly not ready. This would be expensive then, just as it would be today. She would have to stay in London. That would not have been cheap. Who was paying for this? And that answer eluded me for quite a long time. Right. Who is Jacob Blakeway? Right, no then. So, go back to the map. Jacob Blakeway is 3 years older than Katherine and was born at Stanton Long. There. As far as I can work out, he farmed land in the area of Brockton, between Brockton and the Moorhouse and Skimblescott. And at a guess, I've got him living somewhere near the Brockton Crossroads, which is 400 yards from Katherine's house. What's more, they would have known each other as children. And it was true at the time, despite what I said earlier, it was true at the time that if your youngest daughter, and there wasn't enough money for a real dowry, if she could make a marriage, make a relationship with a well-to-do local man by dropping down the social scale, sometimes parents would acquiesce with that. So, when she was a teenager, it's perfectly possible that Jacob may have been seen as a possible future husband. He was a yeoman. He could read and write. Didn't leave a mark. His signature is on several documents in the Shrewsbury archive. This is Jacob Blakeway's family tree. Now remember what Samuel said. Samuel said that he was a man of mean condition. But Jacob is not a man of mean condition. If you go back in his tree, we find a parson, we find a knight of the realm, we find the local miller. So yes, he's not of the gentry as such, and he's not a rich man, but he's not of mean condition. He farms about 150 acres, most of it rented from Jasper Moore. He's a tenant. So, as to what he looks like, I've no idea. I picture Jacob as a substantial man. Taller, broad shoulders, looking like something like a blacksmith. But I've got no evidence for that. That's just how I picture him. So what happens? What happens? A year after the events, when the children have been removed from Brockton, from the house, Samuel and his father tried to have Jacob arrested. They tried to have him arrested for adultery. Because in 1616, adultery is a criminal offence. It's theft of property. And they fail. And they fail because on the day that they tried to arrest him, Jacob produced this. The critical point is this. Not wishing that the said Jacob Blakeway be troubled, disquieted, or in any way harmed in or about the premises by anyone, and especially by our ecclesiastical commissioners or the said council and marchers of Wales. And it's specific. It specifically says you may not touch, arrest, detain Jacob Blakeway. It's dated Westminster. And in the bottom right-hand corner is the seal of King James I of England and James VI of Scotland. Big seal. And so the arresting officers would have been faced by this. And he's a yeoman. How does a yeoman from Shropshire obtain what is effectively a royal pardon? How? I asked an expert on this, and he said, well, the normal way is by personal contact with the king. But I can find, and the previous historian Donald could find, no evidence of contact with the royal court. None. The other way, especially under James, because James was short of money, because Elizabeth had spent it all, was you bought one. You paid for a royal pardon. And so I asked a historian, how much would one pay for a royal pardon in the 1600s? And his view was that to someone who was not at court and was not known to the king, you might pay anything up to £5,000 to £10,000 for a royal pardon. And my question then was, our money? Their money? He said, oh, their money. So we are talking about this document being worth in the region of £50,000 to £120,000. Did Jacob have this kind of money? No. And so we're back to money. Who paid for this? Let's move on. Let's move on. It is the 8th of July, 1620. It's a hot day. It's St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Not the Sir Christopher Wren building that we are so familiar with, the earlier incarnation of St. Paul's Cathedral. It's crowded because this is by now a famous case. It's being overseen by James Lee, Lord Chief Justice of England, alongside bishops and other lords. It is the highest court available in England to hear an ecclesiastical case. The equivalent today of a case being heard by the Privy Council. And they are ruling as to whether Catherine's marriage to Jacob is legal and whether she can keep her children. And she loses. She has been losing all the time. None of the legal judgments have gone in her favour at any point. The children were brought down from Shropshire and have been staying at a house in Aldwych, at the house of a man called Thomas Weston, who is a merchant with links to the colonies in America. As soon as the court judgment is known, the children are taken down to the river, rowed down to Deptford Steps, where a ship is waiting. That ship is the Mayflower. This is pure coincidence. Thomas Weston had links to America. He arranged for the next ship to sail to take these children as passengers. And he told the people on the ship that they were orphans from London, which is why they are listed on the ship's manifest and passenger list as orphans from London. 3 of the pilgrims agreed to take responsibility for the children, not to foster them, not to adopt them. They took them on as servants, as indentured servants, which means that the children would have to work out their indenture until they were 16. The youngest was 5. The ship sails. We know, most of you will probably know the story of the Mayflower. It sails around the south coast, it meets another ship, they go to Plymouth, they set off. The weather is not good, the other ship springs a leak, they return to Plymouth. There's much argy-bargy that carried on over weeks while they're trying to effect repairs to the other ship. The repairs are not effective. So in the end, everybody, most people transfer to the Mayflower. Not everybody, but the 4 children did go on the Mayflower. Halfway across the Atlantic, by this time it is mid-October, they hit a storm and they are demasted. They are blown north and they land well north of where they intended to go. They were sailing towards Boston. When they land, there is nowhere, nothing, bare rock. They sail up and down in desperation, trying to find somewhere that will offer shelter. Nowhere. In the end, they are forced to put ashore because they are running out of water. They overwinter on this desolate rocky landscape. Half of the people on the ship die, including 3 of the children. A year later, later on that year, a fishing boat, a small fishing boat moving north from Boston, finds them. Not big enough to transport them, and besides which the people are too weak to move. So they spend the summer where they are, they plant crops, they have in fact by this time gained some assistance from the Indians, and when it comes to the autumn they harvest their crops knowing that 2 ships are coming up from Boston to take them to their colony. They have a final feast, a Thanksgiving feast, before setting off. And it is that Thanksgiving feast that American families celebrate every year today, in late autumn. When they get to Boston, they set up a colony at what they decided to call New Plymouth. If you go to Boston today, you can visit New Plymouth. It's a bit like Bliss Hill in Ironbridge. There are period buildings, there's a copy of the Mayflower ships, people wandering around in period costume. What about the boy? The boy survived, he grew up, he gained his freedom, he became a ship's boy. Then he became a ship's mate. And then after a while he became a ship's captain, he owned a ketch. We know that he came back to England at least 2 or 3 times, but there's no evidence that he ever searched for or met his mother. And that seems likely because there's no evidence that he ever knew who his parents were. As far as he was concerned, he was an orphan from London. He died in the 1690s. The exact date we're not certain. We do have a burial record. So this is the gravestone of Richard Moore, and it's in the Salem churchyard outside Boston in America. It is the only grave marker of anyone who travelled on the Mayflower. And as a result, it is visited by thousands of Americans every year. And when I launched the 2 books about this story, I was bombarded with emails from America about people wanting to establish a connection to Richard and wondering if I had genealogical records, which in the main I did not, because after the close of this story I cut off my research. So for the majority of them I wasn't able to help. In his 80s, he was accused by the elders of Salem, and have you picked up the Salem reference, by the way? Salem is where the Salem witch trials were held. He lived through that time. He was probably a witness to the Salem witch trial. But in his 80s, he was brought before the elders of the church, who probably were all younger than him, and accused of inappropriate behaviour with a female of the parish, and he had to make a public apology in front of the entire congregation. Now, quite what this means is we need to remember that by the standards of the time, for a man to simply talk to a woman who was not with her husband, brother or father was considered outrageous. And so it may be that he simply said hello to somebody on the street. We don't know. We don't know. So to close the story, Katherine lost her children. So I cannot give you a happy ending. Sorry. But there's still the problem of money. Who paid for Katherine's legal expenses? Who paid or supported Jacob in terms of his royal pardon? Who supported Katherine when she was in London? And I didn't know the answer to this. It was really frustrating. Then quite late on in the process, somebody from the Royal Archive sent me an email. They were under 25, so it simply said, you might like this. No, dear Phil, regards, you might like this, right? And attached to that email was this document. And this document, as you can see, is written in Elizabethan script. There were about 16 pages on it. After the second or third line, you get a migraine. Reading Elizabethan script is secretarial script at the time. It is hard work. But, and I won't try and read it. But this was a will. It was the will of a gentleman called Matthew Small. And on page 4 of the will, it starts talking about bequests to Elizabeth More and her children. And it gives a bequest to Katherine More. And Elizabeth More is this man's sister. Katherine More is this man's niece. So we go back and we look, who is this man? This man was one of the foremost merchants in London in the early 17th century. He was so powerful as a merchant that he did not join any of the guilds at a time when it was almost compulsory, if you wanted to operate as a merchant, to be a guildsman. He was not a member of the guild. His father was, and so was his grandfather, not Samuel. He had so much money he didn't need to. In 1604, when James I came down from Scotland and needed places for his courtiers and supporters to stay, one of those men stayed with Matthew at his estate in Paddington. That man later became the Chancellor of the Exchequer in King James's court, and at the time, the Chancellor of the Exchequer was the man responsible for issuing royal pardon. And what does Katherine look like? Well, this is her grandmother. And this is a Holbein miniature. And if you know anything about art history, you will know that Holbein painted the wives of King Henry VIII and other members of the court. He did paint some very eminent people in London at the time, but very few. Which means that this lady was probably a lady in waiting at the court at the time. What she's dressed as, particularly the flower bracelet necklace that she was wearing, indicates that this was probably the day or the occasion of her marriage being arranged, possibly the time that her contract was arranged. This is Katherine's grandmother. She's a redhead. Have you noticed? She's a redhead. And which means that perhaps, just perhaps, this picture that I showed you earlier on, perhaps that's not so inaccurate after all. And that's where the story ends, unfortunately. The money was provided, I'm almost certain, by her uncle. He supported her. He died in 1619, the year before her case finally finished. Would it have ended differently had he been alive? Probably yes. He had enough money to influence the court. But he wasn't there. He died. So I can't give you a happy ending. But what I can give you is a story that connects Shropshire to the founding of the United States of America, to the sailing of possibly the most famous ship that has ever sailed, if you miss out Helen of Troy's ship, and to a story which is full of intrigue. Yes, it is tragedy, but at the heart of that tragedy is a love story between Katherine and Jacob, because she stayed with him and he stayed with her.
Thank you, Phil. Would you like to take some questions?
We're limited to time, but certainly if people have got some questions, or I would be perfectly happy, partly because I am deaf, and therefore I may not, you haven't got a microphone, I may not hear the question. I'm perfectly content if people want to ask me questions at the front, to deal with them there, or we might deal with 1 or 2 questions now. It depends how many there are. Oh, it's a comprehensive stuff. Oh, no, there is a question.
How long before she was contracted to marry her husband did she say she was contracted to marry Jacob? Or was it time?
We don't have a date. The question is, do we know when she was contracted to marry Jacob, and how long before was this? We don't have a date for her contract. There is no written record of any contract for her to marry Jacob. The evidence for it comes from things that she said afterwards, and evidence that she gave to Oliver Lloyd. But it had to have been before her brother died. It had to have been. So I'm assuming that the contract must have been made when she was in her early 20s. But that would still have been late. Most girls in this period of time were contracted to be married before they were 14. And many of them were actually married by the time they were 13, 14. And married, by married I mean married and living with their husband. You know, Juliet in Romeo and Juliet was I think 12 or 13 in the story. So different age standards apply at the time. Yes, sir.
If you're short of questions, how old were nuns when they died?
I would have to confess to a considerable well of ignorance on this. Yes, sir.
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed that. It's not a question, it's more a statement. As an acknowledged MCP, my present day misanthropy about the way life is being led leads me to the fact that I was born 400 years too late.
Well, it often occurs to me, I mean, so I hope, incidentally, that none of the women have been offended by my approach. My approach is meant to be light-hearted, but it seems to me that life for women in the 1600s must have been truly terrible in virtually all respects. I think it must have been extremely fortunate for a woman to have had a benevolent father and a benevolent husband who was willing to treat them as an equal. Because it is absolutely clear that for the vast majority of women this was not the case. In fact, reading through the practices, when you also consider that people were burnt at the stake, beheaded, had hands chopped off, it seems to me that ISIS and the Taliban would have been really well at home. One more.
What happened to Catherine after the children left?
She made one attempt to see them, and that attempt wasn't very successful because she discovered where they were basically, and she went to see them, and she had to be dragged away. And there's no other evidence that she had any contact with them in the 4 years the legal actions were going on. The legal case that I put up on the screen was for 1622, and of course 3 of the children were dead by then, but she was still fighting for her children, presumably because, well, it must have been because she thought they were still alive. We don't have a burial place for Catherine, or for Jacob. There are lots of Blakeways in Shropshire, lots of burial places, especially if you go to Wenlock. There are lots of areas that are called Blakeway this, Blakeway that, but not for Jacob. Her mother is buried at Upton Magnet, in the churchyard of Upton Magnet. I think Catherine and Jacob stayed in London, and I think we don't have records for them because they were disappeared in the fire, because in the Great Fire of London, lots of records. I think she died in 1635. Because in 1635, Samuel More made public the fact that he had married again. Okay? And so the modern day More family came from that second marriage. And he kept it secret, because of course it was bigamy for him to have married again. And he was only safe to actually publicly announce his marriage to his second wife, who was called Elizabeth Worsley, who had lots of money, it was only safe announcing that if you knew that Catherine was dead. So I have provisionally estimated that Catherine must have died, I think, in 1645, which would have made her 45, mid-40s.
Well,
I've got no idea.
well, everybody, there's a booth for our genealogy groups now. How it's possible to reconstruct a whole story from research, even 500 years later, is a miracle. But I'm sure that the film will be out soon. There are some books on that table which may prove interesting to have a look at.